My topic this morning is talk in the classroom. So my question became, how can I encourage students to listen and connect to each other during group talk in partial lessons? That's our weekly Torah lessons. What happens when I implement specific teacher strategies to encourage children to have this kind of discussion? And what do I notice about patterns of participation? If my goal was for students to talk more, then I needed to talk less. So some of my interventions came from talking with experienced teachers, or the literature, or just my own intuition. Questions need to be open-ended enough for students to invite lots of different ideas, but especially for 6 and 7-year-olds, they needed to be concrete enough so they could access it really quickly. So some examples of questions that worked particularly well. Do you agree with Moses' decision to argue with God about punishing the Jews after the golden calf incident? And then we were talking about a parsha that introduced the rules of keeping kosher. This was one they had a lot to say about. Do you think there should be rules about what kind of food you eat and when you eat it? Very occasionally, students in my classroom had used this signal. Some of them had used this signal to indicate that they had a connection to what another student had to say. And of course, that's exactly what I wanted to encourage. So I instituted this signal as the protocol for students to use. Instead of raising their hand, they could raise their hand, but to show me that they had a connection to somebody else's comment. And then I taught them the language to go along with that. They would start their comment with, I have a connection to. It's really easy for teachers to repeat what students say. But if I wanted them to listen to each other, I couldn't let them off the hook by repeating everything. On the other hand, I needed to show them that I valued their listening, and one way they could show me that was by repeating when I asked what another student had said. So I did a lot of asking, especially at the beginning, for students to repeat a comment. And in that context, I did a lot of cold calling. So I called on students who didn't raise their hand to encourage participation. At the beginning especially, I did a lot of modeling about what it means to build off another student's comment and to make a connection. And I used something that I didn't know had a term until I learned this summer, called revoicing, where there were some comments that I felt needed repeating, but I would do it in this way. I might say, so are you saying that? And then I would rephrase the student's comment and give them the opportunity to let me know whether I got it right or wrong. Revoicing gives the comment weight, and it also allows the teacher to rephrase it in more academic and precise language. So I video recorded 10 partial lessons from March through May. I kept field notes and student work. I made a transcript of my video segments. And then I analyzed comments, my comments and their comments. So in terms of teacher comments, I looked at how many modeling and revoicing, the longer types of comments I made, how often I asked students to repeat, or I cold called them or cued them that I was going to ask them to speak. How often did I make a facilitation comment, which might be a redirection or a clarifying question? And then ultimately where I wanted to get to was how often was I just kind of calling on a volunteer and directing their own discussion. In terms of student comments, how many substantive comments did they make? And really that was anything not, I have to go to the bathroom. How often did they use this connection signal and or the language? Were they able to repeat successfully when they were asked? And then the big one for me was who was volunteering to speak and how many students were volunteering. And then I also wanted to get kind of a rough estimate by adding up minutes, it's very rough, of how much was I talking and how much were they talking. So in March, most of my comments were in these 3 categories. I did a lot of modeling especially. There was one 10-minute segment where I heard 2 comments that were connected and I stopped the class and said, let's talk about it. And then we sort of went around. I kept asking about 5 kids to repeat, and kind of unsuccessfully, and we eventually got there. And then I made that connection explicit for them. In terms of student comments, in the beginning, they were not using that connection signal or language too much, and they were only able to repeat successfully 6 out of the 13 times they were asked. And 6 out of the 12 students volunteered. Now everybody spoke because I cold called them, but the 6 who volunteered were sort of the typical volunteers. Now by May, a lot has changed. We've been practicing this for 2 months. Most of my comments in this lesson, 16 of them, were just the call-on volunteer type. So I was just kind of directing traffic. I did a lot less modeling, because I didn't need to. I did a lot less cold calling, because as you'll see in a minute, I also didn't need to. And throughout the process, I continued to ask kids to repeat because I wanted to show, especially some kids, that that was a valid contribution to the conversation, but I did it much less often. So the most profound shift really was I was talking a lot less. So really roughly in March I was talking about half the time, and in May I was talking about a third of the time. In terms of student comments, they were talking a lot more, so they made a lot more substantive comments. In May, they were able to repeat successfully every time they were asked. And then in the third row, a phenomenon that I had noticed starting about halfway through the process was that students started asking other students to repeat a comment that they hadn't understood. And that happened 3 times in this lesson. Significant for me in this particular lesson was 12 out of 13 students volunteered. Now that was a particularly good lesson, they weren't all like that, but I had noticed an uptick in participation, particularly with kids who were previously what I would call infrequent participants. And another angle that I used to look at student listening was written work, because I had also noticed that the better we got at these discussions, the more reflective the written work was of particular comments made during the discussion. So what happened along the way? I'm going to illustrate with a few particular kids. So first, Jenny is a child with learning disabilities, attention issues, expressive issues. When she speaks, it's very disjointed and slow. She rarely raises her hand to participate, and when she does, she's usually off topic. So twice she participated in this lesson, and both times she made an explicit connection to a comment that was made 5 to 6 minutes earlier. And that was perfectly okay in this discussion because the way it's structured, we're talking about one question for 15 minutes or more. In a typical situation, we would very well be on to another topic, and that's why she was so often, her comments were still not relevant. So this was really powerful for me, and especially when I looked at her particular comments. The second one specifically was actually that comment that brought us to the new idea of if we all work together, we get more blessings. It didn't come out that way, it was very disjointed, and I didn't even understand it in the moment. Another child picked right up on it and rephrased it for the class, and it wasn't until I went and I looked at the video and I realized just how significant what she had said. So I have a particularly applicable quote from Sarah Michaels. Discussion gives teachers more access to the thinking, knowledge, and reasoning capabilities of their diverse students. So next, Spencer. It's a child that often doesn't seem to know what's going on. If asked to contribute or repeat, he might say, I didn't hear, I don't understand. And he was one that I noticed in particular asking, can you repeat that? Independently, very often. In fact, 5 out of the last 6 lessons he did that. Twice in this particular lesson he asked if another child would repeat, and then he followed it with an original comment. So I wonder for Spencer if the value that we place in listening and the practice that he's now gotten has made him more metacognitively aware of when he isn't understanding and more proactive about asking for help. And finally, Naomi was a shy, quiet girl. We rarely heard her voice, and she was one who often asked to repeat at the beginning, somewhat unsuccessfully, but quickly she became successful. And then she started volunteering often to repeat when I asked, sometimes adding an original comment. So I wonder for Naomi if this type of discussion was just an easier way in for her into the conversation. So my conclusions: teaching students the skill of listening well can be an invitation into the conversation. Certainly that's true for Naomi, and it was true for Spencer too, who just became more aware of the value of listening. The slow pace of discussions helps certain children access the ideas and engage. So especially Jenny, but others as well who might be self-conscious and need kind of a longer warm-up period before they feel comfortable. Like Naomi, hearing from some challenged my understanding of certain students' capabilities. And Jenny was the most powerful example of that. And it was really another lesson for me as a teacher in the value of using different tools, and I would consider this a tool to engage different types of students to find out what they know and what they think.